All right, good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tiffany Rasmussen with the Columbia School of Social Work, Office of Professional Excellence. Today's panel, the 2020 Post-Elections Debrief, Challenges and Opportunities for Change, is the final in a three-part series organized by OPE, the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and the Social Work Action Lab for Social Justice. Session one was on November 10th, and it provided a space to process the election results. Session two was held on December 16th, and that provided a session, it provided a deeper analysis of the election outcomes on key policies and issues. For today, we are going to be discussing ways that we can move forward through increased civic engagement and hopeful action. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dean Melissa BEGG. Dean BEGG became the 18th Dean of the Columbia School of Social Work on September 1st, 2019. Dean BEGG is an accomplished scholar, a committed educator, and creative administrative leader. Her work has focused on convening interdisciplinary teams, developing innovative curricula, creating mentorship programs, and embracing diversity in graduate education and the research workforce. Dean BEGG is deeply committed to the school's social justice mission and the pursuit of better science for a better society through scholarship, education, practice, and collaboration. So with that, I'm going to turn over the mic and the camera to Dean Melissa BEGG.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thanks to everyone for joining us for today's post-election panel discussion. Today's session will consider how recent events may impact advocacy efforts moving forward. And we have a terrific set of panelists who will interrogate questions of policy reform and the role of media in driving civic engagement. As we get started, I'd like to share just a few words about the Columbia School of Social Work. Our school places social justice and racial justice at the center of all we do. The school's faculty, students, and staff work to promote well-being across all strata of society to ensure that all can reach their full potential. Social workers know from long experience that the main obstacles to well-being are structural and systemic, enacted through policy. Social workers witness the consequences of problematic policies every day. They understand that policies must change, and they see that the route to better policy is through better government, hence our attention on this election. Like many of you, I believe we've just experienced what may be the most consequential election of our lifetimes, certainly the most memorable. And what a month this has been, from the violent attack on our nation's Capitol building by white supremacists to last week's historic inauguration of the first Black and Indian woman as vice president. It's indescribable, but I have to say full of possibility. While we have cause for hope as the rollout of the COVID vaccine begins, our country will still be grappling with the ongoing epidemics of COVID and anti-Black racism for some time. Also with the extreme economic and social damage being inflicted on the most vulnerable among us. Clearly, this conversation could not come at a better time. So on that note, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce our esteemed panelists and our moderator. John Robertson has been on the faculty at the Columbia School of Social Work for many years. He is an expert in social policy, advocacy, and community organizing. In addition to engaging in community social work practice in Brooklyn's Bushwick neighborhood, Dr. Robertson has worked on national policy research initiatives related to poor families, employment and family issues, and the reintegration of the formerly incarcerated into family and communities. MERLIN CHOWKWANYUN is the Donald H. Gemson Assistant Professor of Sociomedical Sciences at the Mailman School of Public Health. His work centers on the history of community health, environmental health regulation, racial inequality, and social movements and activism around health. With NSF funding, he's analyzing previously secret documents on toxic industrial poisons. He's also writing a book examining localism and health politics in the post-World War II era. Dr. CHOWKWANYUN is a member of the Center for History and Ethics of Public Health and the Data Science Institute. Steve COLL has been Dean of Columbia Journalism School and the Henry R. Luce Professor of Journalism since 2013. He's also a staff writer at The New Yorker, the author of 8 nonfiction books, and a 2-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize. From 1985 through 2005, he was a reporter, foreign correspondent, and senior editor at The Washington Post. There he covered Wall Street, served as the paper's South Asia correspondent, and was the Post's first international investigative correspondent based in London. While at the Post, Steve won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the Securities and Exchange Commission. He served as managing editor of the Post from 1998 through 2004. And in 2005, he joined The New Yorker, where he continues to write on international politics, American politics, and national security, intelligence controversies, and the media. COLL previously served as president of the New America Foundation before coming to Columbia. Last but not least, moderating today's session is Karma Lowe, Columbia Social Work's inaugural Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Community Engagement. Dean Lowe heads the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which was formally established just about 2 years ago. During her tenure in a variety of key student-facing roles at the school, she has been a beloved advisor to student advocates who share her passion for expanding diversity and inclusion practices at the school. Under Dean Lowe's leadership, the office provides a wide range of programming and community building efforts, especially for students experiencing marginalization. Thanks so much to all of you. I'm really looking forward to it. So Dean Lowe, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dean BEGG, and thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to all of our participants for joining us here today. So as Dean BEGG mentioned, since Election Day, November 3rd, we've seen a series of what I would consider unprecedented events. We've got a former president, as well as other Republican leaders, repeating false and unsubstantiated claims of widespread voter fraud that eventually led to fervent Trump supporters storming the US Capitol, spewing vitriols of hate and violence. And their actions seem to amplify not only the political divide in this country, but our racial divide as well, which we've all witnessed in the last 9 or 10 months with protests across the country, particularly in the wake of multiple deaths of Black, cis, and transgender men and women at the hands of law enforcement. This, of course, is all happening in tandem with our public health crisis, which has disproportionately impacted our Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. But with President Biden and Vice President Harris taking office last week, bit of hope, they've made clear that 2 top priorities for the Biden-Harris administration are aggressively fighting COVID-19 and advancing racial equity. Yesterday, we saw President Biden sign 4 executive orders that were addressing racial discrimination in housing policies, ending contracts ending federal contracts with private prisons, reaffirming a commitment to tribal sovereignty, and combating xenophobia against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. But we also see dominating the news cycle the upcoming impeachment trial of President Trump, with the Senate dismissing a challenge to that trial by only a slim majority. So given all this, the pandemic, the racial unrest, the political tensions, where do we go from here? How do we move forward in a way that really will result in action and policy change, and also a sense of healing? And John, I'm gonna ask for your thoughts first.
So in 2016, we were all downstairs, and with the help of Michael Friedman, the idea of staying very close to our values really struck me. What is it that matters to you? Because there's going to be lots happening. It's going to be quite a crazy time. It's going to be hard to follow everything, and that each of us are going to have a place for that. The Biden executive orders give us some hope on racial justice, but there's still big issues of the distribution of the COVID virus. In East Bushwick, that's a huge issue. We have seniors around the corner for whom there is no plan at all, but either by New York State, New York City, or the federal government. And so this remains. And then things that happened before COVID still remain. What are we going to do about 114,000 homeless children in New York? And that story is repeated around the country over and over again. How are we going to cope with transforming the prisons and the correctional system into something that is not just a racism affirmation machine? So I have a couple of thoughts. One is that people are going to have to focus, get to know who's working on what, and stay with that, both, doing all the things we do, sometimes writing letters, sometimes going and testifying, sometimes being in the streets, posting on your social media. That's all going to matter. And then the other thing that I'm working on, we're going to continue working on, is making sure that everybody who has the right to vote votes. We're going to see increasing voter suppression after the election. There are lots of forces in the country that are going to be wanting to remove the vote from people that voted this year. And that happens not just in red states, but in New York, we see the multiple primaries. We see systems of disqualifying people from the ballot that have a lot to do with how much voice people really have in shaping the direction. And so I think that we're, as social workers, have a primary responsibility to make sure that everybody who wants to vote, that we're in contact with and we're serving, does vote and has access to vote and can vote. So those are some opening thoughts I have as a beginning.
Thanks, John. Merlin, I'm wondering your thoughts and sort of where we are and where we go from here.
Yeah, well, first I just want to thank Dean Lowe and Dean BEGG for inviting me to speak. It's a very atomizing and kind of alienating time to be alive and isolated. So I'm always grateful for collective events like this, and an honor to be here with my fellow panelists as well. I don't want to sugarcoat the terror, especially after the appalling events of January 6th, the situation we're in, and it's very hard not to focus on the ominousness of the road ahead with all these multiple simultaneous crises at once. But I still do want to switch gears just slightly to things that I'm cautiously optimistic about. Things that make me feel we might be on a promising course. These are made from the perspective of someone whom, I suspect, like most of you in the audience, most people in social work share commitments to reducing inequality and marginalization via racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, other axes of exclusion. We spent 4 years waking up to daily incompetence, sociopathic behavior, et cetera. And I think sometimes that can actually cloud some developments that, in spite of these 4 turbulent years, are actually quite promising, even if we have to put some qualifiers and caveats on them. So what are the things that I'm optimistic about? One is actually a much more militant and active labor movement. So in 2018, there was a series of wildcat strikes by public school teachers in states like West Virginia and Arizona, where participants demanded not just better wages for themselves, but also resources for serious infrastructure deficiencies in schools. And these actually elicited huge public sympathy because the teachers, they weren't just looking out for themselves, but also for their students and larger communities. These actions came on the heels of a successful 2012 strike in Chicago by the Chicago Teachers Union, which actually extracted some major concessions from Rahm Emanuel, the mayor at the time. They were followed by another one quite recently in 2019. And again, both of these Chicago strikes, they attracted national attention, not just because they were successful and not just because they were battles over wages and benefits, but also for the way that these unions drew attention to issues like classroom sizes, school closure procedures, social service needs of the students in and also outside of school, housing needs. Again, this was a labor union that was connecting labor interests with the larger community around it. And this is something that some people in the movement call social justice unionism. I think this is a really promising trend. And we've seen also the emergence of really stellar labor leadership that looks different and is more representative of the modern workforce. So I mentioned the Chicago Teachers Union. They have an incredibly charismatic and Vice President, Stacey Davis Gates there. Sarah Nelson of the Association of Flight Attendants has been absolutely central in not only looking out for her rank and file, but also influencing the various paycheck protection programs that are in past and also future stimulus bills. These have prevented some, not all, but some furloughs and job losses in a number of sectors. And then to John's point about voting, Unite Here, the union, the service workers union, played a still largely, I think, unheralded role in canvassing in states like Arizona and Georgia this time around. And that's to say nothing of its ability also to just grow its membership among immigrant service workers, some of the most vulnerable people in American society, especially during this COVID era. The second development that I find promising is related, and that's just a widening of the parameters of policy debate. So right now, the demand for a $15 an hour minimum wage is now in a bill that is making its way through Congress. This is no longer a fringe idea as it was at the start of this century. And this $15 an hour minimum wage has its roots in initiatives like the Fight for 15 campaign and fast food strikes in New York City that occurred a little bit more than 5 years ago. the idea of stimulus and deficit spending rather than just kind of knee-jerk balanced budget orthodoxy, and the need for more broadly redistributive policies, especially in times of crisis like now, is also, I think, much more broadly accepted as a legitimate part of the debate than it was in the 2000s. And you can see this in a couple of President Biden's appointments to the Council of Economic Advisors, which includes Heather Boushey and Jared Bernstein, both kind of left-leaning analysts of the economy, and Bernstein also a PhD graduate, I think, of the social work school, I think. A third development, I think, is the national reckoning with racism in the criminal justice system. I don't want to overstate this, but at a minimum, there is now, I think, a more central place in deliberation about the brutality of incarceration, the excess funds that are invested in surveillance and policing over social services and police violence. And it's kind of brought these issues out from kind of the niche area of criminal justice reform. There are federal bills now making their way through Congress that would increase accountability for police brutality. They may or may not pass. They probably don't go as far as many of us would like, but they're a start. And there are recent state and local level bills and initiatives, some of which have passed, actually, that ban employers from asking about prior criminal records if they've served time, that allow some ex-felons to vote, that repeal low-level drug offenses and sentences. And these are not inconsequential things, I think, and byproducts of many decades of organizing around these issues. And then finally, I'm seeing social movements and elected office, electoral politics becoming more and more connected. There's a remarkable slate of social justice-minded legislators who have taken office, people like AOC most obviously, but more recently, Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush. Here in New York, at the state level also, the once dreary and comically corrupt world of the Albany legislature has suddenly become very enlivened with an important faction of legislators who are proposing bills addressing sexual harassment, unpaid overtime, and I think most prominently tenant rights, housing rights. And some of these are actually passing and some look like they're very likely to pass. And you actually have a similar trend in the Pennsylvania state legislature as well. The broader lesson, though, I think from these officials is that there's also now a major infrastructure to kind of translate the activist milieus from which these candidates emerged into actual elected office and policy. I mean, in the past, a lot of social movement actors and activists, they would kind of scoff, sometimes with justification, understandably, at elected office and legislation as kind of a bit too insider and too establishment. But I think that's changed now, and it's had some really promising real results. I could go on with other things, but I'll stop there. I mainly wanted to point out that the conditions we're working in may actually be more auspicious than we think. I'm not dismissing, of course, a lot of the terrible conditions we face that John talked about, especially at the federal judiciary level, in the federal judiciary. But I think it is important also to locate some shards of potential that are there, however uncertain.
Thanks, Merlin. And both you and John are talking about sort of social movements and what's happening along with the voters' rights and just political action in general. And I'm wondering, Steve, if you have any other thoughts to share as well. So where do we go from here, given our climate?
Yeah, well, it's good to be here. Thank you, Dean Lowe and Dean BEGG, for inviting me as well. I'm glad to be with Merlin and John too. I thought maybe I could describe two things. One is what we're talking about in journalism and at the graduate school about what journalism practice needs to recognize distinctively in this time of very intense disruption to constitutional democracy in the United States. Unprecedented, certainly in our lifetimes, certainly not in the history of the country, but in some respects, even there, because of the extraordinary changes in the way we communicate and the way politics works in the United States today. So what's our agenda as reporters, as journalists, as editors, as TV producers? That's one conversation that you'll hear, I think, in journalism And I thought I'd just give you a sense of what at least some of us think is important there. And then the second piece of it is change within journalism itself, the structure of journalism, the assumptions of journalism, and the coming debates about social media regulation that I think should be of concern to everyone in civil society who's trying to communicate, whether they're activists or advocates or institutions that see direct communication and influence as part of their mission, because we have been living with a kind of an unusual structure of a public square owned by powerful private corporations that nonetheless adopted for themselves First Amendment principles around speech, which turned out to create a toxic and polluted environment, but also a permissive one for new entrants and new voices. And if that's about to change, I think that is a very dangerous, delicate moment that should be of interest to everyone who's involved in speech and change in the United States. So those are the two things I'd like to very briefly highlight. Let me do the first one first. It's a little bit more. We spent a couple of hours together, myself and the new students who arrived in January last night, talking about the agenda for journalism after the Trump administration. And I think the point that I would just share is that, especially long time at the Washington Post, I'm familiar with the way journalists often go through presidential transitions or election transitions, and they just sort of shift their machinery from one departing administration to the next, following a fairly conventional playbook of what matters and what to cover. So who are the new cabinet secretaries, and what are the controversies that are going to arise around them? And what is the new president's legislative agenda? What are the first 100 days? How's it going? All that sort of coverage that you already see happening. And I think that if that is all that our professional journalists provide to us, we're in deep trouble, because this is not an ordinary transition. There has been a huge breach in the continuity of American constitutional democracy over the last few months. Lots of breaches go over the last 4 years, but I'm thinking about the big lie about the fraud that the president alleged occurred during the election, and that many of his allies and a shocking number of senior elected Republican Party officials who knew better factually, nonetheless endorsed publicly, leaving, depending on which poll you want to cite, a third or 40% of the country with a conviction that the election was stolen. And I think there's a clear line between the big lie and January 6th. So if you're a journalist and you're trying to report on the country today, you can't just accept the transition that we were, thanks to the judiciary and the voters and other sort of resilient institutions, we were able to affect to the Biden administration. You've also got to step back and see democracy itself as a beat, as a subject that is in a different condition than it's been in any post-war presidential transition, I think, that we've had. So what are the subjects? One is, what is the structure of extreme right violence and organizing? What does the kind of, the door that January 6th opened tell us about the structure of right-wing extremist organizing, violence, and disruption? But some of it involves voting itself and its short-term future. And John talked about this, as an agenda. And for journalists, I think covering elections has often been about horse races and parties and competition and polls. And now I think it's quite obvious that we have an urgent subject that requires journalistic investigation and sustained attention, which is the integrity of the voting system itself. Gerrymandering and voter repression are as old as the Republic, and those are also important stories now because we've got a census, reapportionment, And we're going to have a lot of extended struggle over the kind of voter repression laws that we've seen over the last 10 years, the adaptations of ID laws and voter roll purges and other mechanisms. So those struggles will continue, but there's something else that's afoot now at the state level, which is how is this big line narrative going to play out in state legislatures that are going to reconsider the failed process that they participated in to hijack this last election and spin that forward towards 2022. I mean, it's a long conversation that I will cut off right now, except to say that I think President Trump failed to achieve his objective of declaring the election invalid on the basis of allegations of fraud for which he had no evidence. It was almost a cartoonish attempt to seize power in a way that's familiar in many other countries around the world. It was so inept and so transparently without a basis in law that it was doomed to fail. Does that mean that a smarter, subtler form of rigging won't immediately follow? I think from a journalist perspective, you should be asking that question and reporting it out. There's a very good book of political science came out a couple of years ago, a couple of British political scientists, called How to Rig an Election. And it was a survey of elections and proto-democracies around the world, not including the United States. Its central finding is that we're having more and more elections in this world and less democracy. And I think that is kind of where the United States is in danger of heading, particularly as smarter people who are allied with Trump's voters, Trump's agenda, various forms of authoritarian kind of romanticism that he's spread, think about how to manipulate the 2022 cycle and the 2024 cycle using the playbooks that you see in many other countries. And that is something that journalists need to be all over, making transparent, investigating, reporting. And I don't think we're equipped to do that, honestly, because it's a local story. Our election administration is primarily a state function, and we're in an era where local journalism has been devastated, state capital reporting in particular. And then just very briefly on the question of how journalism and media is changing, that should be relevant to anyone who's a speaker in the social media age. I think what the decisions by Twitter and Facebook belatedly to shut down the incitement of the president and his allies around January 6th and the inauguration remind us is that we had evolved into this very, very American, very anomalous and very unhealthy form of a public communications ecosystem or a public sphere or public square in which a handful of very powerful, fast-growing private corporations controlled by founders who are not even accountable to their own shareholders in the case of Facebook, made decisions that you would normally associate with government around the balance between free speech and the public interest, define it around public safety or public coherence. You can use European definitions of the public interest or the more robustly open American ones, but in any event, normally it's the government that writes these regulations or the judiciary that defines the line between incitement and free opinion. And here you had corporations making those decisions and doing it poorly, almost inevitably doing it poorly. And finally, the whole country being confronted with a form of speech that was, even under the extremely liberal US First Amendment standards, as close to incitement as you can pretty well get, standing in front of a crowd and telling them to go down the street and burn down a building. That is in fact not protected speech in at least in summary under First Amendment standards. So it was right to ban it. Now what? Whatever regime emerges, whether Congress attempts to right that regime, whether the corporations attempt to reflect and rewrite their own rules, you have Facebook with its appointed Council of Elders now reviewing whether to allow President Trump back onto the platform. This council, which is something that Facebook selected in order to distance its leadership from responsibility for making these kinds of decisions, is the far right's, it's like a parody of the far right's paranoid fantasy about how it will be defeated by internationalist forces. It has kind of international, it's like a parody of right-wing black helicopter UN fears. And whatever it decides, its credibility is going to be highly limited because it was handpicked by Facebook, a profit-seeking corporation, to decide what the public square will permit in the United States and in other countries for that matter. It is a broken structure. In a normal democratic system, I would say, as you see happening in Europe, even where there is fiercely contested politics, there has been a national consensus about how to get a grip on this and to define where the public interest lies in social media regulation, the balance between free speech and preventing hate speech, the balance between an open forum that allows in new and unconventional voices without gatekeepers on the one hand, and the right to protect one's privacy on the other. Nobody's got a perfect regulatory regime, but the EU and places like Australia are much farther down the road than the United States is. And what's likely to happen now that I think would be of particular interest to some of your community is that it's going to be a very fierce argument in the context of the Biden administration about what regulatory vision to pursue and how to pursue it. And, I think a concern is that whatever form of sanctioned repression of speech is sustained to try to contain the kind of incitement that we saw on January 6th will also be used to repress speech from unconventional speakers on the left and from social reformers and activists. I mean, if you think that somehow there is a regime out there that allows Black Lives Matter to emerge from a spontaneous reaction to police murder in the Midwest that the mainstream media isn't covering, and to be able to use social media to mobilize. I mean, the next time a civil rights organization like that emerges through self-organized speech on social media, whatever regime is now adopted to put down the far-right militia is going to be set down on that movement and then some, for obvious reasons. So how this regime, this discourse evolves, I think is going to be really important. And I fear that in this country, we have a record of just continually overreacting and kind of running from one side of an argument to the other without examining the structure of things. And in this case, I think the structure is broken. Sorry,
Thanks.
I've gone a bit there, but appreciate it.
Oh, no, we appreciate the comments for sure. Thank you. And thank all of you. And please, we want to see today as a conversation. So don't just rely on my questions. Feel free to talk to each other, ask each other questions, interrogate each other, comment, etc. as a free-flowing conversation. You all touched on voting rights as well as social media. And I'm wondering, and this is sort of an open question to all three of you, how, particularly students of social work who are really pushing for advocacy, and we have a social work votes campaign here that John knows really well. So how do we leverage social media, particularly within the context that you just sort of presented for us, Steve, with this, with the possibility of that repression sort of coming to the left now? Like, how do we continue to leverage not just social media, but traditional forms of news outlets, as well as alternative news outlets, to really push our advocacy efforts and to really push for policy reform?
So one thought I'm having listening to Steve is we're going to have to educate people as to what you can and can't say and how far you can and can't go in social media before the censors take you. That's something that social media is not used to, that the limits of vocabulary, what they're going to be searching for to remove, all of that kind of stuff is going to matter as we organize. But I think that, Social Work Votes has spent a lot of work on building social media interaction, and it's had a lot of response. And certainly, if you look at what's happened in the turning over the state of Pennsylvania, the near turning over the state of Florida, the role of both door-to-door real advocacy, but of social media work has made a huge difference. So I have a question for Merlin about what he's saying about unions, because for us, we're not paying much attention to them, I think, in social work. And I'm really intrigued by the fact that you're naming new leadership and real change happening from organized labor.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate this development too much, because if you look at the actual figures for how many people are in a union in the United States, it's like been stuck at 10 to 11%. And it, for a while, looked like the movement was hanging on a thread. But I think labor, people in the movement broadly conceived have been aware of that and have recognized that the labor movement has to be more about just the people in a formal union, and that is why some of the unions that I discussed, flight attendants, some of these teacher unions, have expanded their purview so that they are not just focusing on wages and benefits, but kind of yoking those traditional bread and butter union concerns to larger social concerns. And I think that's why those Chicago strikes in particular generated the amount of public support that they did. So I've been impressed with that. And I think it's certainly, I mentioned leaders as well. I think some of it is actually due to a kind of different sort of union leader that is emerging, that was not kind of the face of the labor movement for most of its history. I've also seen something that is intriguing to me as well, which is a lot of workers in industries that really have no history of unionism suddenly becoming interested in. There's lots of people in the tech industry, for example, who are trying to organize. There's this effort at Google. I mean, who knows where it'll go, but many high-profile magazines have seen unionization efforts and so forth. So I think there's something in the air, but the counter to that is that I mentioned the federal judiciary. For public sector workers, it is much harder now to organize a union because of a series of federal decisions, including a Supreme Court decision handed down a couple of years ago, Janus. So I don't want to make it seem like this is an easy path, but I do think we have some signs that unions, even within these kind of serious constrictions, are influencing public debate. They are behind things like a $15 an hour minimum wage or a broader kind of living wage demand that affect people beyond just union members. So I think there's something there.
Thanks, Merlin. And John, you sort of touched on this a little bit around voting and voter suppression. And I'm wondering your thoughts on sort other strategies that we can employ to sort of maintain the efforts or the growth that we've sustained with respect to voter registration, as well as to sort of move not just rely on social media, but what other strategies can we use to mobilize voters, particularly as we go into the 2022 cycle and then looking ahead towards the 2024 cycle.
So Homeostatus has the Latino Leadership Institute that's developing candidates. And one of the really important parts of any kind of political reform in the country is candidate development. And who's going to run, whether people believe in that, and working with people, identifying people, supporting people early is going to matter a lot. And then if I were reading this election, social media played a big role in it, but there was a huge amount of door-to-door and direct contact work, and that's not over. That's not over. Social media hasn't replaced all of that. I think it's to some degree because people don't really trust it at so many levels. But, I think that the question about how we think about a corrupt democracy versus a democracy that's really responsive to people, and I think one of the most powerful messages that are being given to people is that their vote doesn't count. It's probably the most powerful voter suppression activity that's happened, because people in certain social classes don't believe that. They believe their votes count. So I'm interested in what Steve's talking about in terms of how do we get a hold of this kind of corruption of our democracy, and that our voting efforts have meaning in that way.
Yeah, there's I think there's a piece of proposed federal legislation pending now before the new Congress. It was identified as such a priority by the House leadership. I think that a version of the bill is called HR 1, and it's an attempt to assert federal standards around voter access in order to head off both some of the existing and anticipated restrictions that states with Republican legislatures have in the past and are likely again to attempt to enact. So, for example, it requires minimum amounts of early voting access. It requires same-day registration around the country. It sets essentially a federal floor around state practices, and it kind of substitutes for some of the erosion of the Voting Rights Act in the world after Shelby. At least it's one counterpunch among several. But I think, if you look at the pre-Trump arguments about voter access, voter repression at the state level, I think one of the dangerous things for us to bear in mind now is that the assertion of the false assertion of a danger of fraud was always part of the justification for many of these laws. Whether it was tight voter ID laws, then there was this narrative about sort of improper access to the polls, even though the social science made clear that, as a matter of fact, there was no risk of significant fraud in the absence of voter ID laws. But nonetheless, that argument has stuck with the courts in a way that Rudy Giuliani's, Four Seasons landscaping press conference evidence did not. Equally on voter roll purging, which is a favorite part of the ALEC playbook at the state legislature, ALEC being this conservative funded movement to pass uniform laws at the state level in different legislatures. And one of its areas is voter repression. And so these ideas that because there are rolls of voter registration that haven't been updated successfully, because of course life always changes and people who register to vote move, or they change their addresses for different reasons, that it's necessary to purge the rolls of anyone who is improperly registered. Again, there's really not a scientifically defensible basis for this, but it's a fraud argument that has allowed different states to essentially reset their voter registration, make it difficult for new voters or existing voters who might have sat out a couple of elections to be mobilized for a particular election. All of this is to say, if you take that baseline, which is where we were before the Trump administration, and you add to it the narrative of the big lie and the radical outlook of members of state legislatures in swing states like Pennsylvania and other states. I mean, there was a Pennsylvania legislature who was part of the January 6th attack. And when the president and his advisors made these Hail Mary calls to state legislatures looking for some way to undo the election results, you know, they had various degrees of traction. Michigan pretty much threw them out. Georgia, Republican, a Republican governor, a Republican secretary of state, more notably, and a bunch of civil service servants against their own interest as party members, as elected party leaders, against their own interest, and in the face of relentless death threats, nonetheless certified the presidential result in Georgia and 2 Senate elections. Is that going to happen next time? I mean, how many times are people like that going to come under this kind of pressure and decide that they're going to follow the law? And the preparations for next time to give those individuals who may have less courage under pressure more plausible tools to assert allegations of fraud in the absence of evidence, to prioritize the right of legislatures to conduct their own investigations and to certify votes, to essentially rerun the 2020 playbook, but with more options, more sophistication, and without the kind of central controlling ego of the president as the outcome, but rather a party's outcome and a broader agenda. I think that's what's coming. And it really is going to be in places like Harrisburg and in Madison and in Ann Arbor that this politics is going to play out, and where activists and people who are paying attention, journalists, are going to make a difference or not by how much they are on top of this. From a journalist perspective, you know, this should be a front and center agenda for Freedom of Information Act requests, for investigative reporting, for transparent recording of speeches, for making sure that meetings that occur among legislatures and lobbyists to start to write this plan are discovered and described, accurately described, but made transparent before the public so that this doesn't sneak up on anyone. Anyway, that's my sense of what's out there. It's a combination of continuous efforts to control the electorate, to limit the electorate. That's been going on, you know, for a very long time, but in its modern form was certainly very active right up until Trump around voter ID and voter rolls, with adding in this new kind of powder keg of the big lie and its residual convictions, you know, in the Republican electorate.
That's pretty chilling.
There's a woman who's a professor on our documentary program, June Cross, who with Jelani Cobb did a great film for Frontline about voter repression in Wisconsin that I hope some of you might have seen in October. Very proud of it. It's the first film the school's ever made. I don't deserve any credit for it other than throwing some money into the pot and supporting Jelani and June as they made the film. But it was mostly set in Wisconsin, and Jelani did a big kind of backstory about you know, the history of voter repression from the Civil War through Jim Crow. in the second act of the film that was also quite a tour de force. But anyway, we had a little panel on the night that the film was out, and we got into kind of forecasting these kinds of questions. And June was even darker in her pessimism than me. And I finally said to her, "Come on, it can't be this bad." And we were both, and she said, "But I feel like, it's a struggle. It's a two-sided struggle." Two things happened in the same period of time that are of historic significance. One is that Stacey Abrams won in Georgia. She did it. She and her allies and the thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who worked with her. They kept saying, "We're going to change Georgia." It came close. They had to battle forces of organized state-directed voter manipulation that suggests she probably should have won in 18, but she hung in there. And this movement delivered against a state government that was all GOP. And the votes couldn't be reversed because they were there. And then, against all conventional wisdom, they turned around and did it again in 2 Senate races that decided the balance of power in the Senate. Yes, President Trump gave them a big assist, but they did it. So, and again, these were elections that were certified by a Republican Secretary of State and upheld by a Republican governor who was taking crazy phone calls from the President of the United States, threatening his career and even his freedom. So that's one side of the ledger. And what I'm worried about is the other side of the ledger that you also saw on January 6th. So it's not that this outcome is decided or that the anti-democratic forces in the United States have the upper hand even. I don't believe they have the upper hand, but I do believe that this is a struggle. It's a struggle of great intensity, and it is a struggle that is not a continuous struggle, and it's a new and deeper struggle where the stakes are higher, where the mobilization is more intense, and where I think a lot of complacent journalists, just to speak about my own tribe, and editors and producers who see the Biden administration come in and say, "Okay, yeah, here we are. Well, he lost. Now we'll move on and we'll write incremental stories about, this cabinet nominee." And there's obviously quite a lot to be concerned about in the new Biden administration. Stakes are high. How are they going to manage the pandemic? How are they going to manage the vaccine? Are they going to pass a stimulus? What assumptions are they? How many compromises are they going to make? Of course, that's all important. But meanwhile, out in the country, the 75 million folks who voted for Trump, and let's say of them, the 25 million who signed up for the whole big lie, they're not sitting on their hands, and they have allies in state legislatures and in political power structures. And I think from a journalist perspective, what we should be doing is we should be turning to that story and making sure we can say whatever happens that we deliver transparency to the public. And I think, I don't know, John or MERLIN, from your perspective in the networks that you participate in, the folks you mobilize, like what is the right response if something like that is true?
I'm kind of hearing that. I mean, from what I take from both the remarks, it really seems like we have to have kind of the ability to walk and chew gum at the same time, to note the victory in Georgia and other unlikely states, and to try to figure out how that was done. Because as you said, Steve, in 2018, there were a lot of shenanigans with voter rolls that carried over to the 2020 election. And in spite of those, this remarkable coalition was able to transcend them to victory. We gotta keep an eye on that, while at the same time keeping an eye on the kinds of developments that you're describing. I kind of wanted to tie that to a comment you made about social media, because it has this very double-edged quality to it, right? It was, I think, if not primarily, hugely responsible for a lot of what we saw this summer in terms of bringing police brutality to the kind of center of public conversation, and has been since the very start of what is now the movement for Black Lives. But it has this counter side to it that you saw kind of go. And the manifestation of that was January 6th. So I've been kind of curious about how to deal with this when students query me about social media and what I think about it for advocacy. Because obviously it's been great for consciousness raising. It's great for mobilization, including mass mobilization. I think it's actually been critical for financing too. There are a lot of NGOs and candidates who I think would not have been in the successful position they're in without it. So I've been kind of struggling at how to get beyond this kind of double-faced quality. And maybe it's something we have to live with. As you said, it's a struggle. And maybe that's just something we have to accept, that we gotta fight on two fronts. There's a more optimistic front and a one that's quite scary. But that's, it's a pretty sober picture, but I like the clarity, I think, is actually very useful to have.
So one of the things that I'm thinking about what you all are saying right now is that I don't think that much of the country understands that there's a group of people that intend to win. And they intend to win whatever it takes to win. And maybe on January 6th, people began to see it a little bit. But in state legislatures, in ALEC, in the movements that are around that are bringing authoritarian government. And if we look at the role of authoritarian government in Latin America or the way it rose in Europe, there was a movement that intended to win. And the people that saw it differently didn't rise to the challenge, or hasn't, or sometimes have. And so that message is that, if we sit on our hands, we'll get what we deserve, is kind of what I hear you saying, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I just think about it as from my long, sort of experience and my life in a particular profession. And in that profession, one thing you ask yourself if you're trying to do good work, not just yourself, but with your group, is what matters? What matters? And can we have enough distance from all of the noise and light and the headlines and the audience numbers and the rest of it? Can we have enough distance to ask ourselves what really matters? And when you look back at this time in 10 years, will you have devoted your energy to covering the story of your time if you were privileged enough to be able to make that choice? And so I think what I worry about is that everyone instantly recognized that the Trump administration was the story of our time, and that its departures from norms, the president running a hotel down the street, the refusal to disclose his tax returns, that so many elements of that administration's departures and corruption were just instant inducements to journalism to respond. And at the national level, I think journalism did respond successfully, along with the courts and activists and civil servants and others. And that's why we got through to the extent we did. But the damage that the president did with this big lie from November until January, I think does fall into a different category from the corruption and the abuse of office and even the horrible policies that he adopted and enforced at the border in several iterations, because it has left an irreversible toxic legacy. You know, President Biden came in and with a stroke of his pen ended the Muslim ban. It's already starting to open up the country to refugees under international law again. The border is a very hard place to fix, but obviously he's going to turn his attention there with much better intentions. But this legacy of conviction that the election was stolen and that there is systemic fraud and in various forms of conspiracy is not something that the president can change with an executive order. And so if you ask, what should we be worried about in that way? What matters now? I fear that just isn't part of the discourse right now. And that worries me. And the second thing that has been a big subject of discussion inside journalism and observation, a very good book written about it recently by Margaret Sullivan that was published by Columbia. The thing Nick Lemon runs is not Columbia Press, but an affiliated publishing arm, about local journalism's collapse. You know, it used to be, just as a thumbnail statistic, the Trenton used to have, at the peak of newspapers in the mid-2000s, something like 120 credentialed full-time reporters covering the state government of New Jersey, which is, you know, not exactly a paragon of good governance at any time. Today, there are something like a dozen. So you take that around the country and it's the same. And so where is the capacity going to come from to really scrutinize state government in this absolutely vital time, where I think because of the way elections are administered and because of the way the census and reapportionment works, state government is going to be even more important in the next 2 to 4 years than it typically is. And it's coming at a time when our capacity, in my field anyway, is at an all-time low.
Yeah, I find developments in the political economy of journalism in the past 10 years extremely alarming as well, especially the absence of local news and, you know, the person who hangs out at the court and the state legislature or city hall and so forth. I will say, I don't think this is a solution to that problem, certainly not a full solution, but I have seen activists and advocates, including those who are involved in voting rights, but a number of other issues too, become very savvy at using publicly available data, Freedom of Information Act requests, and so forth, combing through just public records that nobody would even think to ask for. It's not a substitute for journalism, and there are problems sometimes with the way advocates interpret and present this information, but I am impressed by it. One example I'll give is, it's not a voting example, but it's a housing example in New York City. There's a website called justfix.nyc. This is a remarkable website. You type in an address, you know, if you're a tenant, you can type in your address and you can see your landlord and all the violations that landlord has had, the name of your landlord, so that if, you know, you have some reason to file a complaint against this landlord, you actually know who owns the property, and who might be associated with a shell company and so forth. This is an entirely advocate effort on the part of advocates. I wish this was something that these kinds of projects were things that local newspapers had the funds to produce. But there are examples like this. This is certainly not the only one of advocates producing incredibly impressive databases and portals that allow people to analyze this kind of information. I wouldn't be surprised to see that happen in the voting rights sphere if it hasn't already. Again, it's not a substitute for journalism that systematically and regularly and reliably looks at this day in, day out. But to your question about whether in orbits I'm around, I've seen things. I have seen this as a promising development. And I kind of think it reinforces this double-edged quality of technology. Technology it contributed to what happened on January 6th and the big lie and so forth, but it is also making it a lot easier to access and present information to combat it.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think you know, in many ways, civil society and activists, advocates, the line between journalism and all of those spheres has been blurring, you know, for 10 years, 15 years in ways that are mostly good, sometimes challenging for orthodox journalists to cope with it. But one of the great things about being at the graduate school is that when you encounter the next generation of journalists who choose the profession by coming to graduate school, they're already way ahead of this set of questions. They're already interested in journalisms, you know, plural is, I think, maybe the best way to think about it. There are real advantages to the methodologies that a newsroom like the Washington Post continues to practice, and the kinds of impacts it can make through its approach to reporting. But there is no reason to argue or to even think that you know, a civil society organization that is strategically using FOIA requests and just absolutely churning this stuff on social media so that everybody has the data and everybody can see this, whatever, you know, the differences in its methodology or even its framing of what it's discovering, that it isn't also contributing. I mean, the history of journalism in the United States has always been a history of journalisms. And while there are some common values around evidence and the search for truth and accountability, the formats and the voices in that field have always, at their best, been quite diverse. And we're clearly moving back into such a realm in this country. Technology brought us there, as well as economics. And I think it's a great thing. What I worry about on behalf of the new entrants is this potential of a rollback of speech, which is a consequence of, as I was, you know, saying at too much length before, it's a consequence of a broken structure that is just not going to be easy to fix. And there's going to be a lot of argument over the next year or two about exactly what we ask these corporations to do or not do. I think John said it well. You know, you do have to figure out what kind of speech passes under the rules that these corporations issue, for as long as the government chooses to put them into the position of controlling the public square, which is what the position they're in now. Because I would think that, you know, that your networks, John's networks, you're not trying to figure out how to incite violence without violating Twitter's rules. You're trying to figure out how to, you know, speak truth to power without being called out as a hate speaker or something like that. And you know, that is actually an easier problem to solve than if you want to start a violent revolution and still conform with, you know, Facebook's standards. But it does require attention, and the ground is going to be shifting. And I think in general, things are going to get tighter.
Have you seen any, it's kind of an egghead question, but I think it is, for the reasons you outlined, of concern to anybody who is an advocate and uses social media in some way. Have you seen any kind of framework for content regulation that is not self-regulation that looks promising? I mean, it seems like most of the movement is on antitrust issues, but
yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, it's true. Unfortunately, you know, it sort of depends on what kind of country you're willing to live in. And the reality is that we live in, you know, a country that has been defined by First Amendment traditions that are the most open in the world. I mean, Supreme Court jurisprudence about what speech is inappropriate speech are so narrow that they really only apply to shouting fire in a crowded theater. And that's why it was doubly shocking that President Trump, Rudolph Giuliani, his son, standing at that rally and basically saying, go sack the Capitol, actually got very close to or crossed a line that is generally very difficult to cross under American law. Now, if you go to France or Germany, those standards are much tighter because there are affirmative laws against hate speech. You cannot express anti-Semitism or racism online or in the public square without potentially being held accountable. Now, such a law, if passed by Congress or a state legislature, would almost certainly be overturned by the United States Supreme Court on First Amendment grounds. The odd thing is that when Facebook does it, or Twitter, and here I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I hang around some, and I'm so fact check me on this, but my understanding is that when Facebook or Twitter does the same thing, they essentially ban your speech, not because it's going to incite violence, but because it is hateful. They have no First Amendment restraint in censoring you because the First Amendment protects speakers against the government. It doesn't protect speakers against corporations. And if you sign up for Twitter's rules of service, you are joining a voluntary speech community that is not protected by the First Amendment in the same way. So because we've got this, the reason antitrust matters is that that's a way to break up this strange structure we've inherited with these big, powerful corporations substituting as the government. But it's not going to happen anytime soon. So the reality is over the next 2 or 4 years, the speech that's going to be permitted and the speech that's going to be suppressed on both the left and right is going to mostly be decided by these corporations that are acting in a gray zone between the First Amendment and a consensus against mobilizing hate online. And I think it's a very sensitive time, and I think the consequences of a more repressive regime aimed at the right will be felt by the left pretty quickly.
So, yeah, this conversation, while as powerful as it is, does not in any way address what happened in the streets of cities last summer, and what are we going to do about the historic divide that these very institutions have created amongst people in the country, racially and particularly racially. So I'm sort of sitting here wondering, if we're building systems that protect the vote, how intentionally is that going to look at the incredible racist structure of the challenge to the vote? Because the challenge to the vote is basically a racist challenge to the vote. They're not challenging white votes almost anywhere. So as happens in America, this conversation could just completely overwhelm the conversation about creating a more just country. And so I'm sitting here as a social worker, as somebody who's about to go into a social policy class in a minute, thinking about, it's not that I don't hear what we're saying, but I also hear that, this kind of a conversation is going to have to be what we would call at the Columbia University School of Social Work prop infused. And voices of people who are not white are going to have to be playing a significant role in this, I think. So that's just a comment. I don't know if it goes anywhere, but it's sort of one of the things I'm thinking as we roll along with this.
But how do we ensure that, John? I mean, I know we've seen, and MERLIN sort of mentioned this earlier, where you've seen activists entering into the political sphere, and we've seen social workers in particular taking legislative office. You know, our lieutenant governor in New Jersey, we've had our own alums who hold political office. So particularly for our social work audience, you know, how do we hang on to that hope and really inspire people to either enter that political sphere or just to continue their efforts, whether it's through social media, whether it's, as you said, door knocking on the ground, community organizing, like we saw in Georgia, where you had coalitions of Asian Americans, coalitions of LGBTQ folks, you know, Stacey Abrams networks, sort of all working together to really mobilize voters. So how do we continue to build on that momentum, you know, in the midst of sort of all these, the struggle that you've all talked about, particularly with respect to our legislative body?
And when you're talking about voter protection, it's really, can we change that to state level? You know, can we move it?
So how can we move it at the state level?
Well, I think a lot of, I mean, this is not my professional sphere, but my sense as someone who talks to people in it, in my reporting, I have the sense that a lot of people are going to be looking at Georgia and trying to reverse engineer exactly what happened, and to also understand that, as Stacey Abrams herself said after the election, you know, leadership and ground mobilization, they do matter, and that persistence matters. And there was just a sense of inspiration, I think, that a lot of civil rights activists that I've interviewed expressed about that victory. You know, the civil rights struggle is always 2 steps forward and 1.5 steps back, and there aren't that many visible achievements that have a kind of a playbook attached to them as quite as prominent as what happened in Georgia. And you know, it's sort of striking that the effort in Georgia succeeded, but that it fell short in states with you know, in some ways, you can argue about it, but that it fell short in North Carolina, that it fell short in Florida. And that, to me, as my reading of the demography and the history of those states at presidential election time, I can't help but see the tipping point in Georgia as being the organizational effort, because it wasn't as if they had a better demography to work with. Yes, the demography in Georgia was changing in ways that Stacey Abrams and other organizers long predicted could produce a result like this. But they also were up against a very intense, you know, as has been mentioned, voter suppression machinery that's as old as the state of Georgia, and yet they overcame it. And so, yeah, I think that is part of the answer. It's of course elected leadership and success in state legislatures and at the gubernatorial level. But what this movement proved in Georgia was that you can also do it from the bottom up and still have an extraordinary victory, it seemed to me.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, John, my sense, I was kind of thinking last night when I was just doing a little prep for this, that if I compared our baseline now at 2020 to what it was in 2012, I think the 2020 landscape, while still missing many things, just looks a lot more promising. I mean, there's voting rights infrastructure, labor infrastructure, an entire kind of new set of organizations that is devoted to recruiting certain kinds of candidates. You know, sometimes the candidates flop, sometimes dramatically, but some of them have succeeded also in very surprising ways at both the state, at all levels of government, really. That's something to build on. So.
So if we have a social work audience, then it, this, what I hear being said is that really us getting serious about facilitating votes in states, and we've talked about Madison and Ann Arbor, but there's also what's happened in Phoenix, and there are these key places. But then again, in New York, as people were talking about, there are key issues that are going to be decided both at city and state around education and so forth, and so. This is my back to, if we sit on our hands, we'll get what we deserve. This is just work that's going to have to happen. And the only way really to prevent these things is to get control of the legislatures in the end. That's the only way to control them.
So I see we only have a few minutes left. I want to be mindful of time. So I know John has to teach at 2 o'clock. We have a couple of questions that come into the audience. So I'm just going to post them to all of you. One from our chat box. Is there some way to have a user-friendly, neutral platform which educates citizens on how to analyze the veracity of various information sources?
I mean, there are user-friendly is probably the hardest part of that question, because there are various forms of modeling, prototyping, and experimenting going on. They range from fact-check organizations that attempt to label stories that go across social feeds. There are new companies that have been started to try to establish some kind of consumer standard for reliability in journalism. And then, of course, the platforms themselves have been trying to eliminate the controversy they face on this issue by figuring out, if they can, how to automate a sort of filter to promote accurate and verified information over false information. I think in that is the approach that's had the most impact, just because of the sheer scale of the platforms. I think the problem that Silicon Valley has had, and that it demonstrates again and again, it doesn't seem to have the capacity to solve, is that these are companies created by and run by engineers. And whenever they face a problem of scale, by instinct, they try to solve it through engineering by writing a better algorithm. This is, to be fair, necessary because the scale of these platforms has grown so huge that there's no way to catch all of the bad information by hand. And so they keep trying to write better code. But as you can imagine, it's not adequate. And so I think the real answer to that question for an individual, if I'm advising my uncle or aunt about who genuinely wants a reliable information but may not be sure how to obtain it anymore, is something that, as an idea that's been around for a long time, which is to promote media literacy. It's now more urgent than it used to be. It's also a difficult project, about as difficult project as civic education in this country. But there is a way to educate yourself, to make your own choices and to come to your own assessments about how to read news and information from day to day. It's not a playbook of trusted sources. It's a methodology for being able to see into and to evaluate news and information yourself in order to detect systemic fraud and in order to detect methodologies that are generally scientific in their intent.
So as Karma said, I'm teaching it too. It's been a great pleasure to be here with you both, Steve and Merlin. Yeah. I leave both motivated and chilled.
It's a never-ending story, right?
Yes.
Thanks, John. So another question, this is our last few minutes. How can we engage in pragmatic action to minimize the chance of Trump or a Trump-like individual ascending to power?
Sorry, I was reading this terrorism alert when you asked that question. I didn't quite hear it.
No problem. How can we engage in pragmatic action to minimize the chance of Trump or Trump-like individuals ascending to power?
Well, I think we've described it. I mean, I think it's basically between what John and MERLIN have said and my perhaps unhinged rantings about my concerns about the integrity of elections over the next couple or 4 years, given the big lie. I think there are basically two things. One is to continue to successfully mobilize voters so that the country can be heard in all of its fullness, and to continue to have trust that if we really do have an inclusive democracy, then at election time, the prospects for preventing an authoritarian or anti-democratic agendas from turning the country dramatically backward are very good. And I do think that part of our system held up under extraordinary pressure. I just worry that that's not the last test. And so that's the second part of the equation, which is to be alert and aware of what the events of 2020 forecast about vulnerabilities to the vote in 2022 and 2024 in a very practical way. This is Trump's election in 2016 was a trailing indicator of the rise of authoritarian populists around the world. It had already happened in Hungary and in Poland and in the Philippines and in India. And this is not, we are not, yes, we are a very distinctive country in a lot of ways. And a lot of our systems are kind of strange compared to other countries, especially the primacy of states in so many areas. But we are not isolated. This is a global playbook. And the ideas that he floated around anti-democratic rationalizations for seizing power and controlling elections or throwing out legitimate votes, those are very common around the world. They're just usually done in a more sophisticated way than he did. And I am alert to the possibility, the probability that people will attempt to do it in a more sophisticated way next time around. So that's the other half of the struggle. I think MERLIN put it that way, that there's two halves of the struggle, and they both have to do with voting. I think the offense is where most people's hearts are, and that's where a lot of the resources and tradition lies. I think there's a defensive side now, a counter to authoritarian and anti-democratic movements that is also going to be necessary. I think certainly from a journalist perspective, I think that is clearly a story that we need to cover.
I would say on the kind of affirmative side of things that we can do, two modest ones are, one, to just be aware of new constituencies, new electoral constituencies, particularly immigrants and the direction that they go politically. I think there is an assumption sometimes not earned by people in our orbits that immigrants will vote for liberal or left-leaning candidates. But, if you actually read immigrant media, there's a writer actually for the New Yorker occasionally, J. Caspian Kang, and he's pointed out that if you actually read immigrant newspapers, sometimes it's a very kind of different world, worldview that emerges from that than the sources that I think most of us read. So I think one is just to be aware of these new constituencies and their potential. And the second is a question I have struggled with, which is what to do about people who are not on our quote unquote side. I think it is not worth anybody's time to engage with QAnon readers and people who were supportive of the January 6th events, who believed what Steve has called the big lie and so forth. But there is a slice of people who voted in that way, who I think do not necessarily subscribe to these kinds of zany sort of theories. Is it worth engaging them? You know, I don't know. It's an open, there's kind of like a, labor input return calculus there, and also some questions about whether that is the constituency we should be spending our time on. But I do think not everybody who voted for Trump was necessarily a QAnon, MAGA type supporter, and many of and there's a very complicated discussion about what the actual socioeconomic status and demography of your modal Trump voter is. But I think it is worth asking at the very least, to remember that there are these voting blocks that we shouldn't take for granted, and that might actually be worth engaging, not just for elections, but just generally speaking.
Thank you, Merlin, and thank you, Steve. And I want to thank John, even though he's not here. We are over time, but this has clearly been a robust conversation. And so I want to thank you all for sharing your thoughts and your important insights. You can see from the chat box, it was definitely appreciated by our audience as well. And I'm going to turn the mic over to Dean Begg for final words.
We really cannot thank you all enough for an incredibly powerful discussion and wake-up call. So thank you, Karma, Steve, Merlin, and John. Because it's my nature, I have to end on a positive note, despite all of that, because we have to remain vigilant. I'm going to end with a quote from the poet, Amanda Gorman, that we all heard last week. "It's because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it." I think those are the perfect way to close today. Thanks again.